Hi, welcome to our lesson that focuses really on globalization. And I wanted to bring this up because it's a really interesting idea. When we talk about cultural diversity, I've mentioned all the groups that we'll be looking at and the diversity that we see in our society. And a lot of the diversity or the increasing diversity we see really has its roots in this notion of globalization. That is, we now live in a world where all parts of the world are more and more connected. And a lot of this has to do with technology, which we'll take a look at. But one of the things that's fascinating about this is, of course, this has a lot of impact on cultures. So nowadays, cultures interact with each other in ways that were really never possible in the past. I even think locally in this area. Think about how things how diversity has increased and how things have really changed. So, for example, I'm always still impressed when I travel around just around the Canton area here, and I see the amount of Japanese restaurants and sushi restaurants that popped up. When I was a kid, sushi was something that you didn't see in this area. It just wasn't something that was culturally typical in this area. But now, as people's values and as we have this globalization where people are transferring ideas and beliefs and even foods and such, you now see that people's attitudes and such are changing. In fact, I would venture a guess that 90% of the people who are eating sushi in this area have probably never been to a country or a culture where that is typical. So we see this related to globalization. So when we take a look at this definition, globalization is just the breaking down of national boundaries because of advances in communication, trade, and travel. So what essentially it means is the world shrinks because of globalization. So you can have companies, for example, like Apple, which will design a product in California. They'll build the product in China, like the iPhone and the iPad, but they're using parts from all over, pieces from all over the world. So this is something that is really possible because of these advances in communications, trade, and travel. One thing that you all may have noticed in this last recession that happened in 2008 is that because of this, it means the economies of the world are more and more connected in a way that they weren't in the past. So this is the year after the recession begins, and you can see that it wasn't a recession in the United States. It wasn't just a recession. Here it was a global recession in part because we are so connected now. If an economy as big as the United States is hurting, other economies are going to be hurting, and the same is becoming increasingly true of other large economies like China and some of the other ones out there, Germany and Japan. Okay, so the world is changing, and this globalization plays into it. So up until the 1960s, the United States was really represented by this idea of the melting pot, that everyone came here and then essentially became the same. And one of the reasons this happened goes back to this notion of technology. The world was changing. And back in the 1950s and 60s, before we see really an explosion of this technology, the melting pot was an idea that was reinforced by mass culture. So people had very shared similar experiences inside the United States. Educational experiences were very similar. Military experiences were very similar for people across the board with the draft that occurred with Vietnam and some of the previous wars. And then, of course, the media experience was very different back in the 1950s and 60s than it is today. And if you think about it, you can take a look at this idea of massification. And what massification is this idea that media was aimed at everyone, right? So media was aimed at everyone. Media was not something that you went after a certain population. You made shows for the entire United States population. And Of course, before cable really comes along, that was in some way kind of a necessity. You only had a few channels. They were the basic channels that you could get over the airwaves. So everyone was trying to get everyone to watch whatever shows they were creating or making. So if you go back to the 1960s, you can kind of look at the shows if you can actually make this out, but you can see that, probably many of these shows you've seen or at least heard of if you haven't seen them. But these were shows that really were aimed at the entire population. Shows like Bonanza, and the Andy Griffith Show, and the Lucy Show, and Jack Gleason Show, Green Acres. These were shows that pretty much everyone was watching because there weren't many options, right? They were not aimed at certain segments of the population. However, what happens in recent decades here is we start to see this idea of segmentation. And segmentation is is shows and media that is selling itself to different populations. So it's an understanding, for example, that you're not going to get everyone to watch your show, but you have certain demographics or certain groups that you're really aiming your show towards. And cable and those sort of things have really made that possible. And of course, the internet is a huge part of this because, you can go on the internet and find anything you're interested in. So it's not just general sites for everyone. If you have a hobby or something, you can go on there and go to that very particular site that's created for you and for people that have like interests. So here's an example just to show you kind of to think of how this has changed. So you've got segmentation here going on. And so I put in some of those channels, and think about these channels. They have a certain population that they're generally aiming towards. So you have channels like BET, you have channels like Sci-Fi, science fiction, if you're not familiar with that one. And I put up two of the news channels so you could see it. Here's MSNBC and here's Fox News. And if you're not familiar with, you kind of should be, but if you're not, maybe you just don't pay attention to cable, or maybe you don't have cable. Fox News is generally the channel that is aimed towards people who are more conservative, on the conservative side, and MSNBC is a news channel that's aimed at people that are more on the liberal side. Nominally, they're both news channels, but they really both have an agenda in some way, or that is, they have a certain population that they're going after. Fox News, conservative individuals, MSNBC, liberal individuals. So that's just something to think about, this whole segmentation. So think back in the 1960s. If you were watching the news, you were probably catching the nightly news. This would have been that was something that was massification, right? It was made for everyone. So you weren't going to have people displaying really hard, strong attitudes, either conservative or liberal, because they didn't want to turn anyone off. Nowadays on these channels, they'll of course do that because they can, because that's the population they're aiming for. So technology is, of course, really some of these technological advances are really what makes this segmentation possible. Let me jump ahead here just a little bit. So, and I want you to think about how this has changed. I mean, one of the things, in addition to there being different populations that these shows are created for, one of the things that's really changed is that when we look at the amount of media that's available, it's tremendously increased from the past. Whether we're talking television, whether we're talking the internet and radio and all the different sort of technologies, we are all pretty much inundated with media 24/7, unless unless you absolutely choose to turn yourself off to it, to say, I'm not going to watch this, I'm not going to be on television and those sort of things, I'm not going to watch cable all the time. And I want to give you an example of how these technological changes can actually lead to some misperceptions or some perceptions changing in the United States. So let's look at this idea of the media and fear. One of the big trends that I mentioned was the rise of sort of 24-hour news coverage. So no longer is it just the nightly news. You can tune into Fox News or MSNBC or CNN or any of these channels that are 24/7 to watch news of the day. And oftentimes, of course, they get caught up in crime stories and stories related to crime because they tend to be stories that people are interested in. People will watch it, they can make money off of it. So oftentimes this becomes, sort of the big thing on these channels, kind of 24/7 coverage. And so I'm going to ask a question. Is the United States a more dangerous place now than it was 30 years ago? Now, most people's gut reaction to that question is yes. Yes, absolutely. It's a much more dangerous place today than it was 30 years ago. The United States has got a higher crime rate. There's more violence. There's more horrible killings and those sort of things. But the interesting thing is when we look at violent crime rate in the United States, and we actually take a look at it, violent crime in the United States has really been falling since the early 1990s. In fact, if you actually take this violent crime rate and kind of look at it, I'm going to look where it stops right there. If we actually look at the violent crime rate in the United States today, it's equivalent to the crime rate that we saw in about 1975. That's usually a big shock to people because the attitudes or the ideas is that the world has become a much more dangerous place since 1975. This is the years of my childhood, and people weren't really worried about what your kids were doing. You could go out and be gone all day and just playing around and outside, and no one was really paying much attention because people weren't worried that you were unsafe. Nowadays, of course, people are much more concerned about safety, but ironically, as far as violent crime goes, violent crime rates are at about the same level as they were in the mid 70s. Where if you had a misperception that violent crime was up, where did it come from? Well, I would suggest that it probably came from the media, at least sort of these perceptions that crime is certainly up. Okay, so all I want to do here, just to finish up, is um, just to mention that when we are actually looking at globalization and we're looking at all of these trends that are going on, they have a big impact on culture. So culture is affected by these things, of course, because globalization allows more cultures to connect to each other. It allows for the transference of information and cultural traits, right? So, for example, if you go anywhere in the world, Hollywood movies tend to be pretty big business, so people oftentimes are learning about American culture, correctly or incorrectly, from what they see maybe perhaps on television shows or from Hollywood movies. And of course, it goes the other way around, that we start to borrow many, many things in the United States from not just the cultures that may be part of the United States now, but from cultures that are really sort of outside the United States, but it just becomes part of our traditions and it becomes part of the new way that our culture operates. There's a lot more transference of information and ideas, and that's really the key when we talk about this idea of globalization. So, once again, just to be clear, remember that these little introduction mini lectures here are not meant to replace the reading and all the materials in the material folder. That's where a majority of your questions on the quizzes and such will come from. These are kind of just to get you started, to get you thinking about what's going on. Of course, you'll see some of the concepts that I talk about, but of course, there's a lot more to cover. So be sure to use those course objectives that I have for each and every lesson. Use those those lesson objectives to kind of guide your reading and guide your studying so that you know what to be looking for, because that's how I write questions. I use those course objectives. So um, have a great week, and I know we're early on, but keep up the good work, and don't forget those due dates. Everything's due at a certain time in this course, and everything you sort of get locked out once a lesson's over. It's on to the next lesson, so don't get behind in this class. That's generally true for all the online classes. You got to be very careful about that. So, like I said, have a great week.